Let's begin with the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingian dynasty was a major Frankish dynasty that ruled nearly 300 years beginning in the 5th century. Its most important leader was King Clovis from 482 to 511. Clovis established Frankish power in the former Roman province of Gaul. He also brought the Burgundians and some Visigoths under his control. Importantly, in 496, he converted to Christianity and established it as the Frankish religion. Upon the death of Clovis, the kingdom was divided among his three sons and splintered into three major regions: Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. Power became more decentralized, and local officials ignored royal decrees, becoming more and more powerful. By the mid 600s, Merovingian kings were powerless figureheads known as the Do Nothing kings. During this time, power became concentrated in the office of the palace mayor, or the major domo. This was an official who upheld the wishes of wealthy landowners in the king's court. Next, we have the reign of Pepin II. Soon the landowners and the major domo assumed control of the kingdom, and by the reign of Pepin II, the kingdom was still not united. Pepin II's illegitimate son, Charles Martel, gained power as palace mayor after his death and changed the course of Frankish history. Next, we have Charles the Hammer Martel. Martel went about strengthening the Frankish military, especially cavalry, and expanding the borders of the Frankish Empire. Martel found that he had the support and respect of the Catholic Church and the Pope because he was also spreading Christianity while expanding the borders of the empire. As a result, the Pope asked Martel for help against the invading Lombards. However, Martel was already dealing with the Moors, a Muslim group from northwest Africa who broke free of the Vandals and spread north, controlling most of the Iberian Peninsula by the 8th century. As the Moors began to threaten the southwestern portion of the Frankish kingdom, Martel engaged them in battle and beat them soundly at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE. The Battle of Tours was historically significant because it stopped the advance of the Muslim Empire, which had successfully conquered much of Europe. Many historians believe that had Charles failed, no power in Europe would have been able to halt Islamic expansion. Charles divided his land between his sons Carloman and Pepin. After Carloman returned to religious life, Pepin the Short became the sole ruler of the Franks and continued to consolidate and expand his power to become one of the most powerful and successful rulers of his time. The Pope sanctioned and presided over his coronation as king of the Frankish state, anointing him in an Old Testament-style ceremony. Pepin III, or Pepin the Short, was the first of the Carolingian dynasty. When the Pope was driven out of Rome by the Lombards in 753, Pepin III stepped in and the Franks invaded and forced the Lombards to cede the land around Rome. This land became known as the Papal States. When Pepin III, or Pepin the Short, died in 768, he was succeeded by his son, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. Hoping to maintain control of Western Europe, the papacy decided to crown Charlemagne the first emperor of the Romans. He was anointed by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day of the year 800 CE. Some historians believe that Charlemagne was surprised by the coronation and would not have gone into the church to pray that day had he known the Pope's plan. As he knelt at the altar of St. Peter's Basilica during Mass on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned him Imperator Romanorum. Nonetheless, Charlemagne used these circumstances to claim that he was the renewer of the Roman Empire, which would remain in continuous existence for nearly a millennium as the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope's motivation for crowning Charlemagne was to give the papacy and the Church implicit authority over the empire, since with this act, Leo set a precedent for crowning emperors, which subsequent popes would do throughout the reign of the Holy Roman Empire. As head of the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne wanted to reunite the former Roman Empire. However, given that many at the time, including the Pope, did not recognize the legitimacy of Empress Irene of the Byzantine Empire, the two empires remained independent and continued to fight for sovereignty throughout the Middle Ages. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor, though, intended to represent the continuation of the unbroken line of emperors from Augustus to Constantine VI, had the effect of setting up two separate and often opposing empires and two separate claims to imperial authority. For centuries to come, the emperors of both West and East would make competing claims of sovereignty over the whole. Charlemagne did ultimately succeed in linking France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy into a bureaucracy with standardized weights and measures, and acted as an imperial ruler. Charlemagne led over 50 successful military campaigns. Soon after taking the throne, he was begged by Pope Adrian I to help against the Lombards. In just under 6 months, he ended the 200-year reign of Lombards in Italy. But unlike his father, Charlemagne did not hand over all conquests to the Pope. He placed the crown of Lombardy on his own head, added the kingdom to his already great territory, and henceforth called himself King of the Franks and of Lombardy. Greater than his conquest of the Lombards was his conquest of the Saxons, who lived in the pathless forests and swamps of Germany. Over the course of 30 years, he slew Saxons by the thousands, making cruel laws against those who clung to their heathen faith, and forcing all to convert and be baptized to Christianity by force. Thus, Charlemagne also expanded Christianity while expanding the kingdom. The political reforms wrought in his capital, Aachen, were to have an immense impact on the political definition of Western Europe for the rest of the Middle Ages. Charlemagne's improvements on the old Merovingian mechanisms of governance had been lauded by historians for the increased central control, efficient bureaucracy, accountability, and cultural renaissance. Around 780, Charlemagne reformed the local system of administering justice and created the scabini, professional experts on law. Every count had the help of 7 of these scabini, who were supposed to know every national law so that all men could be judged according to it. Judges were also banned from taking bribes and were supposed to use sworn inquests to establish facts. In 802, all law was written down and amended. The Frankish kingdom was subdivided by Charlemagne into 3 separate areas to make administration easier. These areas, Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, were the inner core of the kingdom and were supervised directly by the Missatica system and the itinerant household. Outside of this was the Regna, where Frankish administration rested upon the counts, and beyond Regna were the Marcher areas, ruled by powerful governors. These Marcher lordships were present in Brittany, Spain, and Avaria. Charlemagne also created 2 sub-kingdoms in Aquitaine and Italy, ruled by his sons Louis and Pepin, respectively. Bavaria was also under the command of an autonomous governor, Gerald, until his death in 796. While Charlemagne still had overall authority in these years, they were fairly autonomous, with their own chancery and minting facilities. The Carolingian Empire was the largest Western territory since the fall of Rome, and historians have come to suspect the depth of the emperor's influence and control. Legally, Charlemagne exercised the bannum, the right to rule and command over all his territories. Also, he had supreme jurisdiction in judicial matters, made legislation, led his army, and protected both the church and the poor. His administration attempted to organize the kingdom, church, and nobility around him. However, its efficacy was directly dependent upon the efficiency, loyalty, and support of his subjects. His greatest institution was that of the Missi Dominici, or king's messengers. These king's messengers were officers whom he sent into all parts of his kingdom to see that the laws were kept and that no one suffered injustice, to listen to complaints, and generally to attend to all matters in connection with the state. In spring each year, Charlemagne held a great parliament, which from the time of year was called the Mayfield. To this the king's messengers came, bringing with them their reports. Thus, although Charlemagne's kingdom was so large that he could not himself visit every portion of it every year, through his messengers he learnt what was going on in each part of it and could thus keep it under control. Another of Charlemagne's great works was the institution of schools. When he came to the throne, there was hardly a school throughout the length and breadth of his kingdom, and he himself could neither read nor write. But he knew how important a thing learning was, so he encouraged it in every possible way. As there were no learned men among the Franks, Charlemagne sought them from other countries, offering them large rewards if they would come to teach his people. Many answered his call, but none among them helped him so much as the Englishman, Alcuin of York. He became a master of the school which Charlemagne founded in his own palace, and of which Charlemagne himself was a pupil. Besides this one in the palace, many other schools were founded throughout the kingdom, in connection with the churches and monasteries. In these, not only the sons of noblemen, but the sons of freemen and others of lesser degree learned to read and write. Libraries also were founded, so that those who learned to love literature might not be utterly destitute of books to read. For in those days, one must remember, few private people could afford to possess books. They were all written by hand upon vellum or parchment, and were often beautifully decorated with colored initials and pictures. Writing and copying a book was slow work, so there was comparatively few to be had, and they cost a great deal of money. As emperor, Charlemagne stood out for his many reforms: monetary, governmental, military, cultural, and ecclesiastical. He was the main initiator and proponent of the Carolingian Renaissance, the first of three medieval renaissances. It was a period of cultural activity in the Carolingian Empire occurring from the late 8th century to the 9th century, taking inspiration from the Christian Roman Empire of the 4th century. During this period, there was an expansion of literature, writing, the arts, architecture, jurisprudence, liturgical reforms, and scriptural studies. The effects of this cultural revival were largely limited to a small group of court literati. According to John Contrini, quote, "It had a spectacular effect on education and culture in Francia, a debatable effect on artistic endeavors, and an unmeasurable effect on what mattered most to the Carolingians, the moral regeneration of society." Beyond their efforts to write better Latin, to copy and preserve patristic and classical texts, and to develop a more legible, classicizing script, the secular and ecclesiastical leaders of the Carolingian Renaissance applied rational ideas to social issues for the first time in centuries, providing a common language and writing style that allowed for communication across most of Europe. Unlike his father Pepin and uncle Carloman, Charlemagne expanded the reform program of the Church. The deepening of the spiritual life was later to be seen as central to public policy and royal governance. His reform focused on the strengthening of the Church's power structure, advancing the skill and moral quality of the clergy, standardizing liturgical practices, improving on the basic tenets of the faith and moral, and rooting out of paganism. His authority was now extended over church and state. He could discipline clerics, control ecclesiastical property, and define orthodox doctrine. Despite the harsh legislation and sudden change, he had grown a well-developed support from the clergy, who approved his desire to deepen the piety and morals of his Christian subjects. Charlemagne expanded the reform program of the Church. The deepening of the spiritual life was later to be seen as central to public policy and royal governance. His reform focused on the strengthening of the Church's power structure, advancing the skill and moral quality of the clergy, standardizing liturgical practices, improving on the basic tenets of the faith and morale, and rooting out paganism. His authority was now extended over the church and state. He could discipline clerics, control ecclesiastical property, and define orthodox doctrine. Despite the harsh legislation and sudden change, he had grown as a well-developed support from the clergy, who approved his desire to deepen the piety and morals of his Christian subjects. Upon his death, Charlemagne was succeeded by his only surviving son, Louis the Pious, 814 to 840. However, upon the death of Louis, the empire became divided. In 843, with the Treaty of Verdun, the empire divided into three parts: the kingdom of Charles the Bald, the kingdom of Lothar, and the kingdom of Louis the German. The Carolingians were displaced in most of the regna of the empire in 888, but ruled in East Francia until 911, and held the throne of West Francia intermittently until 987. Conflicts and divisions within the Frankish Empire only worsened and led to the success of Vikings in later years. One chronicler dates the end of the Carolingian rule with the coronation of Robert II of France as junior co ruler with his father, Hugh Capet, thus beginning the Capetian dynasty, descendants of which unified France. The Carolingian dynasty became extinct in the male line with the death of Eudes, Count of Vermandois. His sister Adelaide, the last Carolingian, died in 1122.